Welcome back to another entry in the Nova lore video series. My name is Spencer Campbell. I'm the creator of Nova and the Novaverse game series, and I'm excited to be back at this. It's been a little while since I've done one of these videos. One thing I want to note before we dive into today's topic, which are who are the Shards, is that kind of going forward, I'm going to do a slightly more casual format to these than I had done before. When I did my first few videos of this, I had like a very specific script that I wrote out on a Google Doc, and I was reading it word for word, and it sort of, listening back felt a little stilted and a little sort of forced. So this time around, I'm just going to be sort of reading a very short bulleted outline and kind of going with that instead of me reading a specific script. So hopefully this more casual format is a little bit more interesting for you to read. It's certainly going to be more interesting for me to say. The one other thing I want to say before we dive into today's topic is that this video in particular is lining up and being released pretty close to the Big Dusk update that is coming out. There's going to be links in the description below and on the screen for my game Dusk, which is about the characters that we're going to be talking about today, the Shards. And so I figured, hey, I'm doing this big update for the game. Why not do a lore video on who these characters are in case people want to know a little bit more about what that game might be about. So a general overview is about who are these Shards, right? What is a Shard? Who is a Shard in the Novaverse? The term Shard very specifically comes from the fact that these individuals are rogue agents. They are sort of broken off pieces of the various factions that live on Oberyn. When I say the word factions, I'm talking about like the humans and sparks who live in the Sun Cities. I'm talking about the Lunar Cult. I'm talking about the Corvus Dominion. I'm talking about the Hellions, the Spore, all these different factions that live on Oberyn. These Shards are pieces, shards, if you will, of those factions that have kind of gone rogue. They're off doing their own thing. You can kind of think of them as sort of mercenaries for hire. They live out in the dusk, so they don't live amongst the factions that they used to be a part of. They kind of band together. And when they band together, they do that for the sole purpose of working together as sort of operatives for whoever is willing to hire them. The other sort of origin point of the word shard here to describe them is that literally these camps got started by using stolen pieces of the sun, aka shards of the sun. So there's sort of a kind of a multi-layer aspect to the name of them. They gather together in these small teams called cells. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And like I said, their goal in the Oberyn or in the Novaverse is to take on missions from any faction that is kind of willing to pay for their services. So let's talk a little bit about then the origins of the Shards. The first Shards were humans from the Sun Cities. Primarily, they were spark pilots. So sparks are these, amazingly powerful exosuit mech sort of things that can kind of go out and wipe out enemies, and they're unbelievably powerful. They're powered by literally pieces of the sun. You can see them in the games in terms of the game Nova that you play as the sparks in Nova. And these spark pilots, for one reason or another, sort of got burnt out. They might have been kicked out of the academy, depending on who they were, or they might have just kind of gotten tired of the life as a spark, and they, alongside some other capable folks in the Sun Cities, stole pieces of the sun that power many of the cities on Oberyn, and some of the sun tech, the sort of the technology that is powered by the sun, and then they stole it and they left. They took that stuff out into the dusk, and they used that to set up shop, essentially. And so that's where we get the origin of the name Shard, and that's where the first Shards come from. So they're primarily humans, and they were humans with some combat experience. I mean, these were spark pilots. These were people who were really, really good at fighting the other factions on Oberyn. They didn't have their spark suits anymore, so they had to be a little bit smarter about how they engaged with things. And inevitably, that means that they're going to run into other people in the factions in Oberyn who might have sort of a similar origin point as them. They are also broken pieces from their factions. They have been separated from him, they've been kicked out, or they've just left on their own for one reason or another. And this again sort of reinforces the name Shards, as all these broken pieces come together. When they come together, a group of shards is known as a cell. These are a bunch of shards that have come together, and they banded together for one reason or another. It could be that they have similar goals. So, for example, a number of shards might get together because they are seeking revenge. Maybe they were all kicked out of their various factions for one reason or another, and they have gotten together so that they can use one another's services and expertise and specializations to strike back at the factions that banished them or kicked them out or whatever whatever they might have done to them. They might have similar interests. It might honestly just be luck that a cell of shards get together. They might just happen to run into one another. And lastly, it could just be survival. It's unbelievably dangerous to live on Oberyn, especially out in the dusk. Anybody who's trying to survive in the region of the world known as the Dusk, which is basically anything that's not a sun city or one of the established cities or homes of the factions, is called the Dusk. And it's really, really dangerous because what's basically going on is that the sun exploded in the sky, and there's sort of this lingering, chaotic, psychic light that's coming through the dying sun that sort of tainted the land of Oberyn. And so anybody who's out there for a long period of time exposed to it kind of starts to get twisted and changed. It's pretty gnarly out there. And so these shards might simply get together so that they can just survive. That, more numbers, they have a better chance of surviving whatever is out there. When these cells get together, they create a base. A core central part of all shard bases is that they have a miniature sunwell, very similar to the sunwells that we see in the cities on Oberyn, the human-centered cities on Oberyn. This is again thanks to sort of the stolen technology. They stole pieces of the sun from these cities. They used that to sort of create very, very small-scale versions of these sunwells. It's just enough to kind of power their base. The most important part of a sunwell, besides providing power, is that it provides light and warmth. And then the singularly most important thing is that for one reason or another, the influence of sun shards seems to push back that negative influence of the dusk. So that warping stuff that I talked about earlier, that's kind of held at bay the closer you are to a sunwell or a piece of the sun. And so every shard base has some form of a sunwell purely to protect the shards within it from the outside influences of the dusk. And then bases are sort of expanded beyond that depending on which factions live inside that base. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about technology of the shards, but you can imagine that a base that has a lot of shards that are Corvus Dominion agents is going to look really different than a base that has a lot of spore in them, those sort of mushroom humanoid beings. Those are going to be two very different looking bases, but they all are, like I said, going to have that core tenet of a sunwell inside them. Another thing that we'll see when we talk about sort of the broad organization of the shards is that there's some faction representative that either lives in the base or regularly visits the base. This is again because shards are mercenaries for hire, and so the factions of Oberyn will reach out to shards for one reason or another. We'll get into those reasons in a little bit, and they will hire the shards to do things. For some factions, that might mean just having a standing representative that just lives with a shard cell that they've grown a close affinity to. For other factions, that might mean just sort of popping in and giving a set of instructions or doing a dead drop. Especially if we consider humanity, sparks will hire shards, and that's kind of a no-no, and so it would be sort of unheard of to have a spark living inside a shard base, but it would be totally normal or acceptable to see lunar cultists just living amongst the shards. So like I said, this sort of faction representative is there. It's a core tenet of all of these shard cells and bases, and whether or not they're in the base or not, it kind of varies depending on the faction. I want to talk a little bit now about the motivations and goals of the shards, which is difficult to do because it varies greatly. For some shards, it's seeking out fortune or power. They are getting paid for this work. And if they're not getting paid directly, like currency doesn't really mean anything to the shards, but they're getting paid in technology usually. The factions that hire them will give them things that make them more powerful. And not only are they getting things from those factions, but every time they go out on these excursions into the dusk, they are seeking out powerful technology and knowledge from old Oberyn before the sun exploded. That stuff's good. That stuff's really, really powerful. And so a lot of shards are just doing it for the thrill of fortune and power. Some also do it for the thrill or this, seeking fame. Spark pilots, they get really powerful and well known for being these cool, badass pilots, but, it's really the spark, the suit that's doing all the work. Maybe they feel like they weren't getting the credit that they were owed, and so they want to show that they themselves are very capable. The other primary reason that I mentioned earlier is revenge. A lot of the people who make up a shard cell were kicked out of their faction for one reason or another. And so they might be simply seeking a way to get back at the people that kicked them out. So let's use a Corvus agent, for example. One of their motivations might be revenge. They might be a burned agent, right? So the Corvus Dominion will sort of burn agents who have sort of failed a mission or sort of revealed sort of some of the secret plans that the Corvus have in mind, and so they just cut them out of the flock. And so a Corvus agent might just want to get revenge for being burned. They might also be part of a shard cell because they realize they have this unbelievably specialized training in infiltration and sabotage and assassination, and that's super valuable. And there might be people out there on the planet Oberyn who are willing to pay for those services. Rather than just being a soldier or agent for a massive empire, why not go show those skills off and kind of get paid to do it? Most shards will engage with work that has at least some connection to their own self-interests. A lot of them will still do things just simply to get paid, but most shard cells at least have sort of a core tenet or a core goal that they have in mind, meaning that they won't just take every job that comes through their door. So factions who are looking to hire shards are going to be seeking out cells that are sort of in line with whatever sort of work that they are interested in. So to sort of speak on that, I think it's easier to kind of talk about the goals of shards by instead talking about the goals of the factions that hire them. So let's talk about the major factions on Oberyn and why they might hire shards. The Corvus Dominion, for example, these are these avian aliens with unbelievably advanced technology. Why would they need to hire sort of this ragtag group of soldiers? Well, primarily, Corvus are going to hire out the shards for intelligence gathering when they can get, because shards can get into places that the Corvus can't. Shards are sort of gray in the spectrum of good versus evil on Oberyn. The factions don't really perceive the shards as something that is immediately opposing them, so shards can move around relatively freely on the planet. As a result, they can get into places or access to places that Corvus agents can't. Another reason the Corvus might hire them is that they're just simply a distraction. The Corvus have all these complicated plans going on in the background, and they might just need somebody to do something over here so that their work over here goes unnoticed. The Hellions, the sort of fire-obsessed, apocalypse-chasing war bands, why would they need to hire the shards? I mean, the Hellions are one of the most numerous factions on Oberyn. They have the numbers. They have weapons. They have tons and tons and tons of people. So what could the shards offer them? Well, while the Hellions do have firepower quite literally on their side, they sort of recognize that sometimes a more subtle touch is necessary. This is not universally acknowledged by the Hellions. This is typically only acknowledged by Hellion warlords who have sort of lived long enough to realize that, yeah, they can smash through most of the things that are in their way, but sometimes they're going to need somebody to do something that a Hellion warband just can't handle. And so they'll hire these sort of specialists. The lunar cults are sort of the exact opposite of the Hellions. They don't have the numbers. They are one of the least numerous factions on the planet, and they're also separated. The lunar cult is sort of a term that's used to describe anybody who worships the moon, but there's so many different sects of the lunar cult that they're like sort of spread out across the planet, and they're not really in a unified vision with one another. And so simply the fact that they don't have the numbers, they just need guns for hire. They have really cool cybernetics and literal magic on their side, but sometimes they just need a little bit more muscle. And so they'll oftentimes hire shards for that. The Spore are an interesting one to talk about because we really haven't talked too much about the Spore in any of these videos. They are a relatively new faction in terms of being added to the lore. These are these sort of collective mind mushroom network that's growing across Oberon, and it's people who are sort of being mushroomified. They're being transformed from the humanoid or the corvus, avian form into these sort of mushroom forms that form a collective. Why would they hire the Shards? Generally, they're just fascinated by them. The Spore's primary goal on Oberon is just to learn. They are just there to absorb and study the other factions and learn and grow. And Shards, like I said earlier, they get access to places that other people can't. The Spore are very limited in terms of where they can go. It's really sort of wherever their Spore colonies are growing. So Shards are going to give them access to parts of the planet that they just simply can't get access to. The last faction to kind of mention here then are the Sparks, which feels a little weird, right? The Sparks are, they're so powerful. They do their own work, right? Why would Sparks hire the Shards? Especially because the Shards really sort of betrayed the Sparks in their origin, right? They're ex-pilots. They're humans who kind of left the Sun Cities and stole the technology that powers the Sparks. But it's sort of a well-kept secret that the Sparks will very oftentimes hire the Shards. And this again kind of comes back to a numbers game. There are a lot of Sparks on Oberon, but they are limited. And so they sometimes just need more numbers in order to get things done. There are some organizations and some cities on Oberon that are more willing to work with what are perceived as the enemy than others. If you think about it, right? If a Spark representative were to walk up to a Shard base and they see some humans, they might be fine with it. But then they also see like a Spore that's like holding human sun technology, or even worse to them, like a Corvus agent that is wielding both Corvus technology and human sun technology. Sparks are not gonna take kindly to that, and also the Corvus is not gonna be comfortable around the Sparks. So there's really not a lot of work that happens between these two, but it's when there's a sort of a certain alignment of interest that we see them working with one another. It's important to note that there's really not like an end game here for the Shards. Unlike most of the other factions, which have some goal that they are trying to accomplish, which is why this sort of eternal war on Oberon is going on and on and on, these factions want something. The Shards don't really. In fact, they want the war to keep going. This is how they survive. This is how they're being paid. This is how they get access to more technology and resources and supplies. And so really the end game of the Shards is just to continue to play all sides, just keeping this war going as long as possible. I want to talk a little bit now about the technology of the Shards. Like I said earlier, every Shard base is going to be outfitted with some sort of small sunwell. You have to have that. Holds back the influences of the dusk, provides warmth, light, power, things like that. You're going to find a kind of a standard array of tools that most Shard bases are going to have. Things like climbing gear. The dusk is a weird place. The ruins of old Oberon are kind of falling apart, so you're going to need things that can allow you to navigate the space, scan for resources or scan for valuables, tools for like extraction, stuff like that. A lot of the work that Shards do is in the space of exploration or intel gathering. So a lot of the technology that they have is related to that role. So, for example, cargo drones are a very common piece of tech. These are these small drones that can kind of fly into a space, create a fast sort of cursory map of the area, and then provide that mapping data to the shards so that they can at least have a sense of what they're moving into, because there's a whole lot of things waiting to ambush you out there. And so these, tools that are going to allow the shards to stay one step ahead of all the other factions are pretty commonplace to find in most bases. Of course, you're also going to find weapons. The core arsenal of weapons that you'll see in these bases are stolen, again, from the Sun Cities of Oberyn, and then they are supplemented by the tech of the factions that have joined up with that cell. So, for example, if you were to visit a shard cell and they have like one or two cultists, like lunar cultist shards amongst them, then you're going to see that base has access to a lot more ritual tools, cybernetics, just kind of general magic items, while a cell shard, or a shard cell that has Corvus agents amongst them, you're going to see a lot of stealth technology in there. You're going to see traps probably surrounding the base, and then traps within the base that they can then bring out with them on missions. So the technology really varies a lot, again, sort of depending on the shards that are within a base. That technology also then varies based off of sort of the standing reputation that cell has with the other factions. Like I said earlier, a lot of these factions are paying the shards in technology and resources, and so if you were to visit a shard base, just kind of looking around, the tech that you would see there is not only an indication of the shards that work there, but also the factions that they oftentimes take work from. So if you were to go into a base and you see a bunch of Hellion weaponry or vehicles and things like that, it might mean that there's Hellion shards there, but it also might mean that this particular cell has a close relationship with a nearby Hellion warband, and that warband is just paying them in napalm tech and motorcycles and other vehicles and things like that. It's just sort of important to note that tech is really kind of like the defining feature of these shards. The Dusk is this truly terrible place, and so shards just seem to recognize that, if they go out there without the right gear, they're just not going to come back. The last thing I want to just briefly mention here is, where do the shards fit in the Novaverse games then? And the answer is that they kind of fit everywhere, and then they fit in a very specific place. They fit everywhere in that any character from the Novaverse games could probably eventually become a shard. So for example, the game Nest, which is about Corvus agents going on this sort of series of missions to assassinate a Hellion, those agents, any one of them could be a burned agent that kind of eventually goes off and becomes a shard. Or any of the Hellions that they kind of spared along the way might break off and become a shard. The game Luna is about lunar cultists doing an uprising and corruption of a city, and any of those cultists might step away after that ritual is completed and go off and do their own thing. They might maybe realize that what they did was terrible, or they might realize that they want to do something even more extreme, and they get branded heretical, so they get kind of kicked out, and then they go off to become a shard. The most clear example of where the shards exist are in what I mentioned at the beginning, the game Dusk, which is entirely focused on shards. This is a game that plays out this cycle of the shards kind of going out, doing these patrol missions, taking on jobs from the factions, getting cool technology based off of the background they're a part of, and doing it over and over again. And so that's it. That's a brief intro to the Shards as a faction in the Novaverse. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm curious to know, which faction do you want to see a deep dive into next? Just let me know in the comments. And if you found this stuff interesting, do make sure to like and subscribe to get more cool Novaverse stuff and more videos related to my game design journey. I'll talk to you later.